Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are covering Kieran Gillen's Uncanny X-Men, or at least part of it. Specifically, we're covering the story of the Dreaming Celestial. Now, there's a few things to understand here. Technically, we are kind of picking up in the middle of a run, which is something that I don't usually advocate doing, but I kind of want to test the waters to see how you guys respond. And the Dreaming Celestial, I think, has always been an interesting character that I've always wanted to cover. But with regards to this story, there's a few things going on. The first thing is that this is part of what's called Regenesis, and Regenesis was the aftermath to Schism. Now, Schism is a story that we've covered, and you'll find a link to that down in the description. But that was basically where Wolverine and Cyclops ended up splitting off the X-Men teams and created their own individual X-Men teams. So Wolverine, you had a story called Wolverine and the X-Men, which basically covered Wolverine's time as the headmaster of the Jean Grey School of Higher Learning. And then you had Cyclops, who remained in Utopia off the coast of San Francisco and had the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. Wolverine's school was back in Westchester, right? But basically the entire community was split. Now, the reason why that matters is because Schism goes into Regenesis, Regenesis goes into extinction, and extinction is the prelude for Avengers versus X-Men, right? It's basically Cable showing up and saying, okay guys, so here's what's gonna happen. Hope Summers is gonna have some crazy things going on, and the Avengers are gonna want to take her. You gotta keep her safe, that kind of a thing. That's kind of what led to the X-Men basically being so standoffish against the Avengers in the first place, was because of the message of Cable during extinction. But the other thing about this is that this basically kind of comes in the aftermath of the death of Mr. Sinister. Now, technically speaking, Mr. Sinister, he died during the events of the aftermath of Rogue and the Hecatomb. The idea here was that, as most of you guys know, whenever Rogue touches someone, she absorbs their powers and their memories. There was a point where the X-Men were in space, and Rogue basically came into contact with what was called the Hecatomb, which was just like this giant bomb, essentially, of the Shi'ar. But what it meant is she came into contact with like all these different consciousness, more or less. And the result was that all these billions of essences essentially kind of set her into a catatonic state. It lasted that way until you got into Messiah Complex. And then when Hope Summers was born, and Hope Summers was taken by Mystique and Gambit, basically Hope was touched to Rogue, and then Rogue woke up. But during that process, Sinister was killed. And so Sinister had remained dead for quite some time. Now, there were a couple instances when he tried to come back. He came back as like Miss Sinister, like a female, for example. None of it really seemed to work out exactly how it was supposed to. This is the first full return of Sinister following his death. And he's really just kind of born out of just some thing out there. It's kind of crazy. Like, he literally just kind of falls out of this tank. Now, we'll find out what it is and how all that works. But that was kind of the prelude to what was going on in the events leading up to this. But essentially, Sinister is fully and totally alive. The other big thing, and this is kind of the last big thing that gets here, is as we get into this story, of course, you have the Dreaming Celestial standing, thousands of feet tall in the middle of San Francisco. And the reason why this happens goes back to Uncanny X-Men issue number 512 by Matt Fraction. And the way this played out is you basically had the X-Men kind of jumping back in time to see if they could understand like the origin of the mutant gene and that kind of a thing. But essentially that information was basically buried underground, and the Dreaming Celestial popped up on top of it. And so at that moment, that's why it's here. Now, it also has to do with the idea of like the high evolutionary meddling with it, different things like that. But the Dreaming Celestials only appeared a handful of times. Probably the most notable instance is when it achieved essentially a role beyond its initial purpose, and it basically joined the Fulcrum into traveling beyond, wherever it was supposed to go. But basically, it's only appeared a handful of times, but it's an exceedingly powerful Celestial. And if you guys want, we can do like a full explanation on the Dreaming Celestial, right? Like the Dreaming Celestial explained. But basically, Sinister shows up here and immediately incapacitates one person because the Dreaming Celestials kind of become a bit of a tourist attraction, and then the other person kind of begs for their life, but Sinister doesn't really care. He ends up basically, killing both of these guys, and that's basically it. And then he ends up touching the Dreaming Celestial. And when that happens, things begin to pop off. Now, what we end up doing here is switching over to the X-Men, or switching over to Cyclops and Emma Frost, with what Cyclops refers to as the Extinction team. Now, the Extinction X-Men team is a powerhouse of a team. Off the top of my head, I can count 2 Omega level mutants, 3 Omega level mutants, possibly 4. You've got Emma Frost, who's definitely Omega level. You've got Storm, who's Omega level. You've got Magneto, who's Omega level. And then you got Magic, right? So like right off the bat, you got a team with 4 Omega level mutants. Like, they're exceedingly powerful. Some are official, some are not, but let's be honest with ourselves, Magneto's up there, and so is Magic. But for those of you guys who are also kind of curious too, what you've got there, that robotic looking person, is called Danger. Now, Danger goes back to Astonishing X-Men by Joss Whedon and John Cassaday, and it was basically this idea that like the Danger Room became sentient. It was a weird bit of a story, but it essentially became a kind of physical being, right? And that's more or less where it comes from. That's why you see this being referred to as Danger. Now, this also comes out of fear itself. That's when you ended up having a Colossus becoming the new Juggernaut, right? And so that's why you sort of see this interesting situation where Danger is talking to Colossus, and it's like, hey, you should calm down in case your other self should make an appearance. And the response of Magic is no, he's all under control, everything's copacetic. This kind of came in the aftermath of that when Colossus was Juggernaut for quite some time. The idea here is that the extinction team of Cyclops is kind of a reflection of the change in his character. We've talked about that before in Marvel, where you basically had Cyclops, who was originally like the Boy Scout of the X-Men, right? He believed in Xavier's dream. You couldn't talk him out of it, right? He was a believer. As time began to progress, and specifically coming out of House of M and really going into like Deadly Genesis, when Cyclops basically learned that he had a third brother that Xavier never told him about, and his third brother had basically died. You know, Xavier sent him on a suicide mission of sorts. Cyclops' view of Xavier began to shift. The fact that he and Emma Frost were the ones basically running the X-Men after the events of House of M, and even for a time the events leading up to it, because Xavier was nowhere to be found, basically meant that when Xavier returned, Cyclops was like, no, we're running the show. You can just sit there and just kind of be an advisor, and that's basically it, which Xavier did. But what it meant is that as time began to progress in Marvel Comics, Cyclops became more and more militaristic, right? He became more and more militarized, and even became more of a villain, falling more in line with like the way Magneto used to be. And that's why this kind of team exists here, is because Cyclops has become extremely heavy-handed insofar as like humanity hates us, humanity has it out for us. Basically, we need to have a strike team available so we can hit them as hard as possible if they hit us. That's why the extinction team is, one, so exceedingly powerful, but two, like full of such heavy hitters. And you know, that's why it has its name. For the most part, the X-Men operating out of Utopia are just kind of monitoring, you know, so like younger recruits go through their regular training where they learn martial arts from Psylocke, different things like that. But for the most part, you don't really see a whole lot doing. It's just kind of a recap of what the various teams are doing. But in the midst of all this, suddenly Abigail Brand ends up yanking Cyclops and Emma Frost away. Now, so a little bit about this, because the Peak and Sword will become a talking point in the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. For those of you guys who saw Spider-Man Far From Home and you saw the post-credit scenes, Sword, of course, is the Sentient World's Observation and Response Department. Abigail Brand is the one who led it at that point in time. In Marvel Comics right now, in the present day, in 2020, it's led by Carol Danvers, as far as I'm aware, and it's called the Alpha Flight Program instead of Sword. But basically, Abigail Brand and Sword were created by Joss Whedon and John Cassaday from back in Astonishing X-Men, but their idea was to essentially introduce a space version of S.H.I.E.L.D. So where S.H.I.E.L.D. monitors Earth, Sword monitors space. And the idea is that there's a lot of questions that are being asked here with regards to Sword, you know, especially with the fact that like the Dreaming Celestials popped up here, because the Dreaming Celestial is a celestial, basically meaning that an alien entity is on Earth. And so because of the fact that Sword doesn't really directly involve itself in the goings on Earth, that's really confined more to S.H.I.E.L.D., they end up contacting the X-Men, basically saying, you guys are kind of the residential experts when it comes to these sort of things, but we're also contacting the Avengers, and you basically end up getting the extinction team that shows up here. The problem is that once they arrive, the Dreaming Celestial begins to kind of change and modify. Its physical body begins to break down and dissolve, and in place of its head, you basically end up getting the head of Sinister. That what Sinister had done is he had essentially infiltrated the Dreaming Celestial and taken it over. And so Sinister kind of like becomes God. Now, of course, this leads to the involvement of Namor the Submariner. Stories like moments like this, and especially during Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, is why a lot of fans who weren't really Namor the Submariner fans before have become such huge fans now, right? They're just kind of like, this guy is legit. You know, it's because of storytelling like this. But essentially what you end up getting here is basically the body of the Dreaming Celestial becoming unstable as the head of Sinister basically leaves, right? And so what this does, and probably one of the most impressive displays of power, is you end up having a few things happening. The first is that as the body explodes, right, as this energy begins to explode outwards, you end up having Colossus, who's sent flying. Emma Frost turns into her diamond form, but her arm's blown off, right? So we'll talk more about that here in a second. You end up having Magneto using the totality of his power to basically reassemble the body of the Dreaming Celestial and then hold the body in place. It's kind of an insurmountable task, and it's really beginning to sort of take its toll on Magneto, but it's a huge display of power, right? Because what Magneto's doing right now is holding together the body of a god. He's acting as its mind, basically holding it together. And so with that being the case, one thing to also understand is that with Emma Frost's diamond form, that was introduced during Grant Morrison's run in New X-Men, a secondary mutation that happened during ES4 Extinction. The way this works is it's very similar to like the Absorbing Man Crusher Creel, right? So if Crusher Creel's in like a stone form and like his arm gets cut off, he can put his arm, you know, as long as he remains in his stone form, he can put his arm back in place and then snap back into his human form and it'll heal in place. it'll hurt like hell, but it'll go back to normal the way that it's supposed to. As far as I'm aware with Emma Frost, it's much the same way. With that being the case, you kind of have, Colossus turning into his juggernaut form, and then essentially going after the head of Sinister. But the problem is that once Sinister arrives at his, ultimate location, he basically ends up arriving at this museum of sorts, and then seems to turn everybody in the general vicinity into Sinister, right? That's kind of what goes on. Now, what follows this is basically a great big huge fight, right? You've got Hope Summers, who's kind of off in the distance, and she's using a giant gun. Now, there's a couple reasons why this is happening. The first is because Hope Summers is a prodigious shooter and sniper because of her time spent with Cable. And so with that being, with that in mind, Hope Summers is also a little unstable when it comes to her abilities, right? She does kind of have the 5 lights. We do sort of know how her powers work, but she's still also at that age where she's emotionally vulnerable, right? So if she begins to sort of freak out or lash out, or things become too overwhelming for her, then nobody really knows exactly how her powers would manifest. And so what this does is it leads to like this massive conflict between these X-Men and all these different Sinisters. Now, in the middle of all this, suddenly Cyclops is contacted by Abigail Brand. And Abigail, he's kind of like, okay, look, I get what's going on. I mean, but this is like a really bad time. All hell's basically breaking loose. And she's like, no. You don't really understand what's going on. Like, there are signatures heading towards Earth. The Celestials are coming, right? Like the awakening of the Dreaming Celestial has basically brought all the other Celestials here. Like, they're making their way to Earth, figure out what to do, or they're going to annihilate us all. If the Celestials show up here and they don't like what they see, that's the end of Earth and everybody on it. And so with that being the case, you immediately end up having one of the Sinisters who shows up and basically sends a kind of parlay to the X-Men, come and meet with Sinister Prime. He wants to talk to you guys. They kind of suspect it's a trap, but it's like, hey, what choice do we really have? We're facing potential annihilation. We just kind of need to have these conversations, right? And so when they show up there and they start talking to Sinister, the first question is, why? Like, what's the whole point of this? Why are you doing any of this? And the response of Sinister is kind of this long-winded explanation of like, because I can. But Sinister's always been obsessed with evolution, specifically the ability to push himself beyond. And that's what he's been doing, that these various duplicates that he has, that Sinister will essentially die. But every time he does die, whatever version comes back that's birthed out of that matrix will come back better than the one that died, right? So he'll always come back more intelligent, having maintained all the knowledge he had, and then learning even more knowledge along the way, right? So each version is an improved version. So Sinister version 1, then version 2, version 3, version 4, so on and so forth. Not only that, what you end up having him doing is basically using the power of the Dreaming Celestial to essentially harness the minds of various people who were out there. Now, this is kind of a big thing that we need to establish here, is that you have Emma Frost in her diamond form. She is completely and totally immune to any form of telepathic attack when she's in her diamond form. There's no way to influence her in that way. That was established back during New X-Men, and it's been consistently solidified over the history of Marvel Comics since that time. But what's really big here is Colossus, with the helmet of the Juggernaut, is totally immune to the telepathic power of the Dreaming Celestial as well. This is no small thing, because what this means is that these two characters, these two Earthbound characters, one of whom is a mutant of the highest order, a telepath of the highest order, the other one who's basically imbued by the power of an other dimensional demon, are immune to the power of a Celestial, or at least to this aspect of a Celestial's power. That's a very big thing. But in the middle of all that, what you end up getting is Sinister, who kind of gives Emma Frost a hard time insofar as saying, like, when he's talking to Cyclops, that like Cyclops' first mate, of course meaning Jean Grey, was the highest genetic quality bride that was available, and when she died, he went with like the next best thing, basically saying Emma Frost is a poor man's Jean Grey, which she is. And so as a result of that, I mean, you guys can't tell me that I'm wrong. Come on, like, anybody who's a Jean Grey fan will be like, yeah, I mean, Emma's okay, but like, let's be honest with ourselves, And so Sinister, just to kind of prove a point, ends up stepping outside, right? While all the X-Men, aside from like Emma Frost at this point, because Colossus's, helmet's been taken off, while they're all basically subdued by his power, and Emma Frost has to maintain her diamond form lest she be taken over by the abilities of Sinister as well. Sinister, to prove a point, steps outside and then is immediately shot by Hope Summers. And then when that happens, it's kind of like, okay, telepathic control is down, and Cyclops is like, everybody, let's go, let's do our thing. And then like another Sinister takes over. And that's kind of the point that he was proving here. Each one of these Sinisters are autonomous, but they're all part of a whole, right? They're all basically clones, and they can all think for themselves. They all share like a singular consciousness, right? So like they're all kind of like, we do our thing, like we have our particular roles that we play. That's what Sinister says, that like once these clones are created, that clone goes out into the community and immediately knows what its role is supposed to be and then fulfills that role. So it's autonomous in that regard. But like at any point in time, each one of these guys are essentially Sinister Prime. That if the Sinister Prime dies, a new one steps up and takes his place. And seemingly the entire collective consciousness makes that choice. And so it's one of these things where it's like, I can never truly die. That's kind of the point and kind of the goal of what Sinister was looking to achieve here. This is one of the things that's essentially kind of carried on into all new, all different Marvel, and especially going into Jonathan Hickman's Dawn of X. Now, for my part, I didn't catch that right off the bat. During that point, I assumed they were all duplicates from Bar Sinister coming out of Secret Wars. But one of the things that a lot of you guys said was, no, that's not what's going on, because Secret Wars basically reset everything from before Secret Wars, that Bar Sinister technically doesn't exist anymore. That those are all basically duplicates of Sinister from this story, right? From the story of the Dreaming Celestial. So kudos to you guys, catching something that I missed. That's always kind of the hope, really, with Comics Explained, that like it gets to a point where a lot of you guys are just kind of like, no, Rob, actually, man, let me correct you here. I kind of like that, right? Because it means that like I learn from you guys and you guys learn from me. And I always kind of enjoyed that sort of give and take that goes back and forth. And so what this does is it basically leads to the arrival of Danger, right? Kind of using her abilities to essentially create a kind of danger room that basically overrides the mental faculties of Sinister for a time. Because keep in mind, this is basically, the Dreaming Celestial, but if its mind can be taken over, can basically be hacked, then it is in some ways a kind of computer. But when the X-Men basically go to make their escape, there's still all these Sinisters here. And that's why things sort of begin to pop off, because in that moment, Emma Frost is kind of like, okay, so like we don't have a choice. Emma Frost basically reverts back into her human form and then uses her telepathy to dominate the minds of all the Sinisters who were there, because that Sinister is no longer in the mind of the Dreaming Celestial, but using her power and basically seizing control of the Dreaming Celestial to shut down the minds of all the other Sinisters who were there, basically leads to the Dreaming Celestial's head basically going awry. And then of course, Sinister reemerges again. And again, that's the nature of it, is it's always kind of like, I will always come back, I'll always return. I'm currently channeling the power of a god. But realizing that the Celestials are coming here, Sinister kind of bails out. But that's one of the things that he says. It's like the Celestials will come here and the Celestials will destroy everything, but I will always exist. I will continue to exist. Not because the Celestials will destroy the world, but because the Celestials will cleanse all life on the world. Now, this is one thing to sort of understand, because one half of it is the hubris of Sinister, but the other half is also because when the Celestials showed up during the second host and they eradicated the kingdom of Atlantis and its capital city Lumeria, it basically laid waste to the deviants and almost completely and totally annihilated them. But what it essentially did is it saw the Celestials destroying their capital city, and then whatever happened would happen, right? It wasn't really their intention to annihilate all life on that world. Maybe that's what Sinister is referring to. But the reality is that when the Celestials show up here and they basically look at a particular race and they see them moving beyond their station or infringing on celestial property or anything like that, the Celestials will cleanse all organic life, right? That's the way this works, right? That's kind of how the Celestials have always functioned. But regardless, it seems to be a little bit of hubris on the side of Sinister, where he basically ends up taking his pistol, putting it to himself, and then, offing himself, kind of this idea that like that he'll always find a way to survive doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. But with the other, the other Celestials arriving here, you end up having like Cyclops, who basically goes up to him and it's like, okay, so like, let's have a conversation. Essentially, all this stuff popped up with Sinister, like all these things went crazy with him. We're not here to cause like, any problems or anything like that. This planet is under our protection. This Dreaming Celestial is on our planet. We're here to protect him. It may have looked like we were seeding some kind of a conflict or something like that, but the X-Men are basically pleading for their life. Now, the saving of the X-Men comes through Hope Summers, and Hope Summers says, you should leave. And the result is that the Celestials end up leaving. Now, there's a couple things that we can extrapolate from this, right? The first is that the Celestials realize what Hope Summers will become, that Hope Summers will become the Phoenix. And so, because of that, she will have an insane amount of power, the power enough to essentially destroy the Celestials if she chose to. The other part of this is the Dreaming Celestial just points to the sky, and the Celestials are like, okay, cool. So they end up leaving. So Hope Summers had nothing to do with it. We can infer either one of those things from this particular conflict. But, this is kind of a moment where the X-Men basically witness all these different people who are here watching all these things unfold. And initially where the X-Men are kind of like, yeah, we're constantly hated, different things like that. They kind of see themselves as being able to take a bit of a foothold in the city of San Francisco because no one's throwing things at them. Now, with regards to the X-Men being here, one of the reasons why nobody's attacking them in San Francisco goes back to the origin of Utopia, in the sense that the X-Men were given that location by the mayor of San Francisco, or maybe it was the governor of California, but I'm pretty sure it was the mayor of San Francisco who gave them that area, off its coast and said like, this belongs to you now. And while humanity, in San Francisco wasn't necessarily in favor of mutants, they were certainly like a lot more enlightened than where you found like the Friends of Humanity in like Alabama, right? Like, I mean, that's more or less where you found like down in the South, or like William Stryker's Purifiers up north, people who were essentially east of the Mississippi. You know, everybody on the East Coast was just like super prejudiced, and everybody on the West Coast was still pretty prejudiced, but just a little less. But nonetheless, you know, it's an interesting story, and I definitely dig it. But let me know what you guys think. You know, if you guys want to see more of this kind of thing. As far as I'm aware, this is the only one that really involves the dreaming celestial. You know, as far as the X-Men go, there may be a few other stories here and there, but we can kind of follow the aftermath of Schism if you guys want to see more of that stuff. But regardless, if you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.